Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. This is the third of a 4-part series on the disappearance of Barbara Cotton. If you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2, you're going to want to pause this here, listen to episodes number 332 and 333 first, and then come back to this one. I again want to thank Anthony W. for introducing me to this case, and to Kathy, Barb Cotton's sister. I'd also like to thank Kathy for spending time talking with me every time I have questions about the minute details surrounding the events of Barb's disappearance and for trusting us with her story. So let's get back to it. In part 2, we left off on the evening of Barb's disappearance and the morning after. How Louise Cotton had made a number of calls the night that Barb was last seen, including a call to Barb's old friend Sandy, who hadn't really been that close to Barb for quite some time, so she was surprised by that. Louise would begin to provide law enforcement with leads, and she would continue to do so for weeks and even months following Barb's disappearance. They were leads regarding Barb being at specific locations, as well as possibly having traveled to Montana with Stacy Werder, the alleged boyfriend. However, I'll just put it out there right now that there is no evidence Barb ever left the state of North Dakota, so we're going to go ahead and pick up our timeline from there. Getting back to the day after Barb was last seen, that would be April 12, 1981. Later on that same day, and I actually have an exact time for this in the timeline, Louise reported Barb missing, and that would be at 3:56 p.m. The report taken at the time, I assume based on what Louise told law enforcement taking the report, stated that Barb had not come home since the day before, that she had last been seen at a friend's house around 10 p.m., and had been with a guy named Stacy earlier in the evening. Stacy had worked at a place called Cakes and Cones, and Louise reported that Stacy told her that Barb told him that she was walking home from Cakes and Cones. The next day, April 13th, 1981, Louise contacted law enforcement to report some updated information that she apparently had. She said that she believed Barb might be in Scobie, Montana with Stacy at the Pioneer Hotel in room 205. Authorities were reportedly contacted and checked out the lead, but found that Barb was not in that room, and there's been no kind of confirmation at all that Stacy Werder was ever there either. Just Louise's word. The next few items in the official timeline involve Stacy, so I'm just going to tell you what was said because his involvement to me is very questionable at best. I'm not going to invest too much time into that story arc. Stacy has been talked about ad nauseum, which is fine, and I might even end up talking about him ad nauseum too. But if I had more than just Louise's word that Stacy was Barb's boyfriend, I would definitely invest more energy into it. You know, I'm ready to jump all over romantic partners when something stinks. But in this case, Stacy isn't on my radar. But he does have somewhat of a colorful background, some brushes with the law, some documented mental health issues. But it's just one of those gut feelings that I'm having, and I am not alone in that. Kathy has suggested that she feels the same way. But my opinion doesn't really have anything to do with what's going on with Stacy, and more with what's going on with everyone else involved in this case. So for Stacy, I'll just give you the basics, and you know what? His story ends pretty abruptly anyway. If nothing else, the Stacy angle is mysterious. There are a handful of reasons why people become suspicious of him. In fact, for some who first hear Barb's story, Stacy appears to be an obvious suspect. But the deeper you dig into his background and the timeline surrounding Barb's disappearance, the more complicated things become. And for me, the less he feels like a suspect. There are reasons to be suspicious of Stacy Werder. I will concede that. There are also reasons why he may not be responsible. But this is one of those things where it feels like Stacy has been talked about so much that the opinions tend to be thought of as fact. Each avenue involving him eventually leads to more questions than answers. I wish I knew more about him, but at the same time, I've come to believe Barb's disappearance is related to something closer to home, so I'm not going to lose any sleep over Stacy. To me, in terms of this story, Stacy is a footnote. Not in life and not in this world. Not as a person, but just as it relates to Barb. Stacy left Williston, North Dakota for Montana shortly after Barb disappeared. That's generally thought of as being suspicious. But the same people who say Stacy leaving is suspicious are the same ones who describe him as a hitchhiking transient. That right there makes the fact that he left shortly after Barb vanished coincidental and, to me, irrelevant. It's been confirmed that Stacy was in Montana by June of 1981 and that he had been hired to work with an oil industry related job, which means he leveled up from hitchhiking transient to oil field worker. The young man had more purpose in life than people really give him credit for. And again, the only person who brought Stacy into this conversation was Louise Cotton. When she first reported Barb missing, she said Stacy used to wash dishes at Cakes and Cones. How did Louise come about this information? I have no idea, but I suspect she gathered some intel during the same night that Barb went missing when she started calling and looking around for her. It kind of plays into what I think happened, which I will share with you after I get through this timeline. There is more information about Stacy that apparently had come from his sisters, but they don't paint the prettiest picture of him or his personality. However, because he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, I feel like the violent outbursts and aggression can be attributed to those types of episodes. And it was that diagnosis which led to Stacy's eventual discharge from the Navy. I don't think I mentioned that he had been enlisted. I may have, and I forgot. The last of his violent outbursts reported by his family occurred when Stacy allegedly attempted to strangle his dad with an extension cord. He was kicked out of the family home, and after that, Stacy would never return. By the time Barb disappeared, Stacy would have been 22 years old, which would be a significant age difference considering Barb was only 15. That fact also goes against how it seems Louise would have reacted to any type of relationship Barb may have had with him. Based on what Kathy has told me, I don't think that there is any way that Barb would have shared with her mom that she was seeing this guy, or any guy for that matter, especially if he was that much older than her. Despite that, Louise seemed to not only be the only one with knowledge of Stacy allegedly being Barb's boyfriend, Louise was the only one feeding information about him to law enforcement following Barb's disappearance. In the timeline of events, we left off when Louise contacted law enforcement about a day and a half after Barb was last seen or heard from to report that she believed Barb to be in Scobie, Montana with Stacy. But the thing about this information that Louise seemed to be privy to is that nobody actually really knows how Louise came to know the information to begin with. And while nobody can say for sure, one thing I am certain about is that Louise probably didn't hear it from Barb herself. I tend to think either one of two things happened. Either Louise gathered some information as she was calling around asking Barb's friends if they knew where she was at and managed to piece together some of these ideas based on what she learned from friends and other witnesses who say that they saw or interacted with Barb on the night of the 11th. To me, it kind of sounds like Louise was on a mission to find Barb the night that she was last seen. This is only my theory based on what I learned mostly from Kathy, but It appears that Barb was out for the evening doing something that teenagers enjoy doing on a Saturday night. Something that Barb enjoyed doing. Maybe she was with friends. Maybe she was with a guy that she was interested in. Maybe she was with a guy she had just met and became acquainted with. Maybe that guy was Stacy Werder. Or maybe it was a guy who just looked like him. Maybe she was out to dinner. Maybe she was at Cakes and Cones. Maybe she was at the party at the 18th Street Apartments. Maybe Barb was doing all of the above. But considering everything that I've heard and everything that I know, Barb was most likely out having fun, living her best life. It was only a matter of months before she'd be moving out on her own anyway, so perhaps she wasn't even really concerning herself with following Mom's rules for the remainder of the time that she was having to live under Mom's roof. Besides, there was a party going on that night and Barb wanted to go. Mom's rules and Mom's roof be damned, right? Louise, it seemed, wasn't willing to simply let the night pass without answers. She was calling around to Barb's friends trying to figure out where her daughter was at. But I don't necessarily believe that Louise was searching because she thought Barb had vanished, and I don't necessarily think that was ever the case. I think Louise was looking for Barb because Barb had broken her curfew. Once again, she was ignoring the rules, pushing boundaries, and doing exactly the sort of thing that had become a source of conflict between them. As the hours slipped by, I imagined Louise's frustration growing. What may have started as irritation was likely turning into outright anger. So she kept making calls, determined to find her daughter. And I don't think Louise intended to stop until she found her. When I spoke with Kathy about some of these details, she reminded me of something important, something to keep in mind as I go along. That their mother had a ferocious temper. That observation is difficult to ignore, especially when viewed alongside the earlier story about Louise tracking Barb down at another house party about a year and a half before. If Barb had been found that night, that last night that she was seen, she almost certainly would have been facing a tremendous amount of trouble when she got home. And that's where a sense of dread and regret begins to creep into the story, because I do think Louise eventually managed to track Barb down that night, and I think she found her. But I also think that whatever happened after that did not go the way anyone could have imagined. In fact, I think things went very badly from that point forward. I'll get more into that when I finish up the timeline. When it comes to Louise's story, even her own recollections add another layer of uncertainty. In a 1985 newspaper article, Louise reportedly stated that she spoke with Barb around 11 p.m. the night that she disappeared, and that Barb told her she would be home later because she had to work the next morning at the country kitchen. What remains unclear is whether that conversation occurred in person or over the phone, and for me, whether that conversation ever happened at all. No one really seems to know the truth. I don't know whether Louise spoke to Barb or not. I don't think Louise just made up all these details that she gave to law enforcement out of thin air. I think she got information from somewhere and told law enforcement some version of what she discovered in order to give investigators something to work with and to keep herself involved and close to the case. However, I believe nothing that she provided, no information that she gave to law enforcement, none of it was useful. None of it ever led anywhere. None of it furthered the investigation, and while the information Louise had may have been truthful, or at least perhaps rooted in truth, I don't think any of what Barb did that night caused her disappearance. But I do think her disappearance was a consequence of what she did that night. At least a part of it was. As for Stacy, I don't know if he knew Barb or not. He had mental health issues and a troubled background. On June 12, 1981, Stacy Werder was taken into custody on disorderly conduct charges in Glasgow, Montana, and held in the county jail for 10 days. A little more than a month later, sometime between July 15th and 16th, Stacy Werder was arrested again in Malta, Montana. but I'm not sure what those charges involved. According to Stacy's sister, he called their family home from the jail to tell them that he was coming home and to ask her to tell their mom that he loved her. She also said that he stated, quote, "I'm damn sorry for what I've done." And that would be the last time anyone in Stacy's family would speak to him. At about 1:30 in the morning after he was arrested, a little more than 3 months after Barb disappeared, Stacy Werder hanged himself while in custody. And that is where Stacy's story ends. Louise contacted law enforcement again on September 1st, 1981, nearly 5 months after Barb disappeared. At that point, the investigation had already begun to lose momentum, and answers seemed no closer than they had been in April. According to police reports, Louise reported that she had spoken to Stacy's mother, Cynthia. Louise told investigators that Cynthia had said Stacy had spoken about Barb before his death, and that if Barb ever came back, Louise should have Barb call her. I've found that account difficult to make sense of. It's not entirely clear why Louise and Cynthia would have been communicating in the first place, or what circumstances led to that conversation. There are obvious gaps in the story, and decades later, those gaps remain. All I can really do is speculate. One possibility is that Louise was still searching for new information that she could pass along to investigators. More specifically, I wonder if she was looking for anything that might reinforce the theory that Stacy was responsible for Barb's disappearance. Throughout much of the investigation, Louise seemed convinced that Stacy should remain a primary focus, and perhaps she was hoping that this conversation with Cynthia would provide something that pointed investigators back in that direction. But even then, something about the story feels off. I struggle to understand why Stacy's mother would tell Barb's mother to have Barb call her if she ever returned. It is an unusual thing to say under any circumstances. It becomes even more unusual when you consider that Barb had been missing for nearly 5 months and that Stacy himself had been viewed as a possible suspect. The statement simply raises more questions than it answers. Unfortunately, that's a pattern that appears throughout this case. And from there, the trail largely goes cold. The investigation never truly moved forward in any meaningful way. The leads became fewer, the answers remained elusive, and the case slowly settled into a heartbreaking standstill where it would remain for years to come. And that is essentially where Barbara Cotton's case has remained for decades. Year after year passed with few answers, little movement, and a growing sense that Barb's story might simply fade into the background of history. For a long time, it seemed as though the questions surrounding her disappearance would remain exactly that, questions. But beginning in early 2021, something started to change. A renewed interest in Barb's case began to emerge, driven in large part by the tremendous work done by the Dakota Spotlight podcast and its host, James Woolner. To date, that investigation has produced 21 episodes dedicated to Barb's disappearance, bringing new attention to a case that had spent far too many years sitting in the shadows. Their work helped introduce Barb's story to a new generation of listeners and inspired other podcasts and creators to take a fresh look at what happened to her. That matters because every new set of eyes, every new listener, and every person willing to examine the facts brings with it the possibility that something previously overlooked might finally come into focus. As for this series here on Killafornia Dreaming, we're going to spend time exploring a theory that has never entirely disappeared from the conversation, but is one that has often remained on the margins. It is a theory that has surfaced repeatedly over the years, only to be set aside, minimized, or left largely unexplored. Not because there's no reason to consider it, but because it's uncomfortable. In fact, it may be the most uncomfortable possibility of all. And for that reason, it is often the one that people are least eager to confront. Yet it also is the theory that Kathy has found herself returning to again and again in the decades since the last time she saw her sister. Through all the years, all the speculation, all the changing narratives, and all the competing explanations, Kathy's instincts have consistently led her back to the same place. That hasn't been easy. Not for Kathy, and certainly not for the Cotton family. Because if this theory is correct, it forces us to ask difficult questions and examine possibilities that many people would rather avoid. But difficult questions are often where the search for truth begins. And while none of us can know with absolute certainty what happened to Barb on that April night back in 1981, I would be doing both Kathy and the story a disservice if I ignored the perspective that she has carried with her for more than 4 decades. The reality is that I find myself arriving at much the same conclusion. The more I've listened, the more I've learned, and the more I've considered the known facts, the more I understand why Kathy keeps returning to this particular possibility. So, this series here on our show will not shy away from that discussion. In fact, we're going to lean into it, not because it's sensational, and not because it's popular, and not because it's the easiest explanation, but because after all these years, Barbara Cotton still deserves an honest search for the truth, even if that truth leads us somewhere uncomfortable. And perhaps that is where hope still lives in this case. Not in repeating the same theories over and over again, but in having the courage to revisit the questions that have never fully been answered. Because as long as people are still willing to ask those questions, then Barb's story is not over. So, one of the important details in this entire case is also one that there is some confusion about. And there really shouldn't be, so I want to clear all of that up now. At first glance, it may seem like a relatively minor point, just a date buried in decades-old records. But as you'll see later, the time frame in which Barbara was officially declared legally dead is actually pretty significant. In fact, it plays directly into the theory that Kathy and I believe best explains what ultimately happened to Barb. Before we get there, though, there's a piece of misinformation that needs to be addressed. Because once information finds its way into a case and it gets repeated often enough, it can begin to take on a life of its own. Over time, people stop questioning it, and eventually it becomes accepted as fact whether it's accurate or not. There is a Find Barbara Cotton website, as well as a Find Barbara Cotton Facebook page. I encourage anyone listening who wants to learn more about Barb's story to visit the website, but make sure when you're on Facebook that you look for the page that says Find Barbara Louise Cotton, because that's the correct page, that's the current page. Any other pages on Barb Cotton out there on Facebook that isn't that one are no longer active and are no longer valid. One of them is older. It's an unofficial page that was created a few years ago and has since been archived. If you're following that one currently, unfollow it and follow the one that Kathy created. Find Barbara Louise Cotton. I will include the page in the show notes, and I'm going to post about it several times on all of the things that I have to post on. And that is the only page where I will be sharing information about this episode and future developments related to this case, my own page as well as Kathy's. Now, according to the Find Barbara Cotton website, there has long been some uncertainty regarding the year that Louise Cotton had Barbara legally declared dead. Depending on the source, that date is listed as either 1988 or 1998. That's a pretty significant difference. Fortunately, clearing it up turned out to be surprisingly simple. All it took was a quick text message from me to Kathy. And her answer was immediate and unequivocal. She told me that it was actually around 1998 or 1999 when Louise had Barb declared legally deceased. And that is not a detail Kathy had to look up. It's something that she distinctly remembers, which is important. Because there's a reason that moment has stayed with her all of these years. There's a reason why that date remains etched in her memories. And there is a reason why it matters to this story. For now, I'll simply ask you to keep that timeline in the back of your mind as we move forward. Because later on, when we begin discussing the theory that Kathy has returned to again and again over the years, that seemingly small detail becomes much more meaningful and much more significant. Sometimes the key to understanding a mystery isn't found in the biggest revelations. At times, it's hidden in the details that everyone else has overlooked. And this may be one of those details. Now, do I think that that discrepancy was some massive oversight that somehow became tangled up with all the other confusing pieces of information that have accumulated around this case over the last 45 years? Maybe, but honestly, the more likely explanation is far less dramatic. It was probably a typo. After all, the numbers 8 and 9 sit right next to each other on a standard keyboard. One keystroke, one small mistake. The kind of error that can happen to anyone. The problem is that even the smallest mistakes can take on a life of their own when they're attached to an unsolved mystery. Years pass, people cite the information, others repeat it. Eventually, someone searches for the answer and suddenly finds 2 different years and 2 different decades attached to the same event. And just like that, another layer of confusion gets added to a case that's already had more than its fair share. The frustrating part is how easy it was for me to resolve that. All I had to do was send Kathy a text message. Within minutes, this massive discrepancy was all cleared up. And to me, that's one of the strongest examples of why Kathy's role in the story, the importance of her role in the story, cannot be overstated. When you're talking about Barbara Cotton's disappearance, Kathy isn't just another source. She is one of the most important people alive who actually lived this story. She was there. She remembers these events. She has spent decades carrying the weight of questions that most of us have only recently begun to ask. So when a detail as important as the year Barb was declared legally dead becomes muddled, my first thought was simple. Why wasn't Kathy consulted? Especially when the information appears on a website dedicated specifically to her sister Barb. That question genuinely puzzles me, because if you're maintaining a website, a forum, a podcast, or any other platform devoted to Barb's case, wouldn't the first step be to reach out to the people closest to her whenever possible? Wouldn't Kathy be one of the most important people to consult before publishing information that could shape how others understand the story? You would think so. As I've said, it took me one text message. The answer was there, which makes it difficult to not wonder why that same effort wasn't made sooner by others involved in documenting this case. And this isn't really about a typo. It's about something much bigger. For years, this story has traveled in countless directions. Some theories gained traction. Others became accepted wisdom. Certain narratives were repeated so often that they became part of the case itself. Yet many of those conversations unfolded without Kathy's voice at the center of them. For reasons I don't fully understand, the perspective of someone who has spent all these years searching for her sister has not always been given the weight that it deserves. And that's unfortunate, because every unnecessary error, every unresolved discrepancy, and every assumption presented as fact creates another obstacle in the search for answers. It's one more misconception Kathy has to correct, One more layer separating people from the truth that she has spent nearly half a century trying to find. But there's hope in that too, because every time a mistake is corrected, every time a question gets answered, and every time Kathy's voice is finally heard, the picture becomes a little bit more clear. And after all these years, clarity is something Barb's story desperately deserves. So why does the year that Barb was declared legally dead matter? Why spend so much time discussing what might seem like a relatively small detail in a case that already contains so many unanswered questions? The answer is that, in my view, it isn't a small detail at all. In fact, it may help us better understand how certain events unfolded, how certain decisions were made, and ultimately how Kathy and I arrived at the theory we believe deserves far more consideration than it has traditionally received. But before I explain why that date is significant, we need to take a step back and talk about the people who occupied center stage in this case for decades. Because since the earliest days of the investigation, there have been a handful of names that consistently surface whenever Barb Cotton's disappearance is discussed. No matter which article you read, which podcast you listen to, or whichever online discussion you stumble across, the same individuals tend to appear. So before we move forward, I want to introduce you to those people, the usual suspects, the persons of interest who have been at the top of the conversations for a long time. But after that, I'm going to introduce you to a fourth person. However, what you don't know yet is you've already been introduced to that person. And this is where things begin to take a difficult turn. Because unlike the others, this individual has often been overlooked, minimized, or left out of the discussion entirely. In many retellings of Barb's story, this person's role receives little attention, if any at all. And to be completely honest, I overlooked this person myself when Kathy and I first began discussing this case. At the time when I first started researching, I had little doubt that this individual likely knew more than they had ever publicly revealed. That much seemed apparent to me. But as I worked my way through the timeline, reviewed the available information, and spent the last couple months having lengthy conversations and text message threads with Kathy, my perspective began to evolve. What started as a belief that this person might simply possess information that was important gradually shifted and then shifted again and again. Over time, I found myself moving this individual from the level of concerned person to potential witness to having been potentially involved or having knowledge to accessory after the fact, and ultimately to direct involvement in Barb's disappearance. I realize that that is a significant statement, and it is not one that I make lightly, and it is certainly not one that I arrived at overnight. But I'm not making that journey alone. In fact, when I finally shared these thoughts with Kathy, she told me that she found herself wrestling with many of the same questions over the years. The difference is that for decades, the conversation surrounding Barb's disappearance was pulled in so many different directions that Kathy often followed where those theories led, hoping that one of them would finally provide answers. Yet time and again, Kathy found herself returning to the same unresolved concerns, the same lingering questions, the same uncomfortable possibility. Now she feels ready to let those facts speak for themselves. Not assumptions, not rumors, not theories repeated so often that they've become accepted wisdom. Just the facts. And where those facts ultimately lead is for each listener to decide. But before we get there, we need to understand the people who have shaped the story, especially in the past few years. Moving into the 2020s, something began to happen that hadn't occurred in quite some time. After decades of silence, false starts, dead ends, and unanswered questions, people started looking at Barbara Cotton's disappearance again. In the years following the COVID-19 pandemic, a renewed effort emerged to revisit cases that had long been sitting on shelves collecting dust. Barb's story was one of them. New listeners discovered her case, new researchers found their way into the conversation, new perspectives began to emerge. And with those fresh eyes came something that had been in short supply for a very long time. Hope. Not certainty, not answers, just hope. Hope that perhaps someone might notice a detail that had been overlooked. Hope that a forgotten memory might resurface. Hope that after all these years, there could still be a path leading closer to the truth. At the same time, there was an undeniable reality hanging over it all. Cases this old are difficult. Witnesses pass away, investigators retire, memories fade, records disappear. Opportunities that existed in 1981 can never be recreated. Every passing year makes the search a little bit more difficult. And yet, people kept looking. Several podcasts took up Barb's story and introduced it to audiences who may never have heard her name otherwise. Some of those shows are programs many of us have followed and respected for years. There was Missing with Tim and Lance, who longtime listeners may remember from their early days as Missing Maura Murray. There was The Vanished by Marissa Jones, and the Unfound podcast with Ed Densel. And of course, there was Dakota Spotlight with James Woolner, whose extensive work on Barbara's case brought renewed attention to a mystery that had spent far too many years in the shadows. I mentioned Dakota Spotlight earlier in this episode, and I did spend some time listening to portions of that coverage. But beyond that, I made a deliberate decision not to immerse myself in every single podcast episode, YouTube video, or discussion surrounding Barb's disappearance. Not because I didn't respect the work that had been done, quite the opposite. Many of those creators helped keep Barb's story alive when it might otherwise have been forgotten. But I wanted to approach this case differently. I wanted to spend less time listening to what everyone else thought happened and more time listening to the people who actually lived it. Because after all this time, after all the theories and speculation and endless debates, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers, if they still exist, might not be found in the loudest voices discussing this case. They might be found in the quieter ones. The people who have been carrying this story in their hearts for all this time. People who never got to stop wondering. The people who never got to stop hoping. And so while others were revisiting the case from the outside, I found myself drawn towards those who had been living with it from the inside all along. And there's a reason for that. Based on everything I had heard and learned up to that point, the person I felt that needed to be heard most was Kathy. Not because other investigators, journalists, podcasters, or researchers hadn't contributed valuable work. Many of them absolutely have. But Kathy is one of the few people still here who lived this story in real time. She has carried it with her every single day since 1981. She has spent so long living with the uncertainty, the grief, the questions, and the frustration. I wanted this episode to be shaped by what Kathy knows to be fact and what she believes in her heart, and also what I think after listening carefully to her perspective and weighing it against everything else that I've learned. What you're about to hear and what you have been hearing is Kathy's voice through me. That may be an unpopular approach in some circles, but it comes from one of the very few people whose perspective truly matters in this case, especially today. And by now, you all know me well enough to know that when I find a story that grabs a hold of me, I don't let go easily. I dig, I question, I challenge assumptions. And if I fundamentally disagreed with Kathy's conclusions, I would either tell her so directly or simply present the story exactly as she wanted it told and leave my own opinions out of it. But for the record, I do not disagree. In fact, based on everything I've heard, everything I've read, and every conversation that Kathy and I have had, I find myself largely in agreement with what she believes is the most likely explanation for what happened to her sister. What's been especially striking during our conversations is that there have been moments when I suggest an idea or a possibility, and Kathy responds by saying that she's considered that herself over the years as well. Sometimes it feels like we're arriving at the same place from very different directions. The problem is that Kathy carries an enormous amount of doubt. And honestly, I think some of that doubt comes from spending decades feeling like very few people were truly listening to her. For years, the story seemed trapped inside a narrow narrative that never fully made sense to her. Certain theories were repeated, certain assumptions became accepted, and other possibilities were rarely explored. Whether those possibilities ultimately proved correct or not, Kathy felt they deserved consideration. All of that changes today. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and say that Kathy may be taking all of us in a direction that the story has never gone before. And that gives me hope. Not because I think we're guaranteed answers after all this time. Cases this old rarely offer any guarantees. But because for the first time in a very long time, someone who has lived with this tragedy from the very beginning feels like her voice is finally being heard, as it should have been. It hasn't come easily, though. I have asked Kathy difficult questions. I've pushed for details. I've asked her to revisit painful memories that most people would rather leave buried. There have been emotional conversations and difficult moments along the way. But after all this time and all these years of watching the story travel down paths that never felt right to her, Kathy believes the time has finally come for the narrative to expand beyond the narrow confines where it has remained for so long. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the next chapter begins. So with that in mind, let's talk about the persons of interest. I'm going to spend a little time addressing the theories that have come to dominate the discussion of this case over the years. These are the so-called quote-unquote popular theories that you will encounter in most, if not every podcast episode, YouTube video, article, or online discussion that has examined Barbara Cotton's disappearance. Some have been repeated for decades. Others have gained traction more recently. Whether they're accurate or not, they've become part of the story's landscape and deserve to be acknowledged. So I'm going to briefly walk through these theories and explain why they've remained such a significant part of the conversation for so long. Then we'll turn our attention to something different. After years of questions, countless conversations, and many hours spent examining what is known, what is believed, and what may have been overlooked, brushed aside, or outright ignored, I'll share with you what Kathy and I both believe is most likely the explanation for what happened on the night Barb vanished. It may not be the most popular theory out there. It may not be the one that people expect, but it is the conclusion that we have arrived at after looking at this case through a very different lens, or at least a lens that not a lot of people have been willing to look through. Let's start with Stacy Werder. For decades, Stacy has occupied the top spot on the suspect list in the minds of many people who have followed Barbara Cotton's disappearance. And when you trace that belief back to its source, it almost always leads to one single person, Louise Cotton. From the very beginning, Louise was unwavering in her insistence that Stacy was Barb's boyfriend. She wasn't tentative about it. She didn't present it as a possibility. She spoke as though it were an established fact. Time and again, Stacy was identified as the young man Barb had dinner with, the person she had been seen with, and ultimately the person she allegedly left town with. Even after Stacy took his own life, that narrative continued, maybe with even more momentum than ever before because he took his own life. According to accounts that have surfaced over the years, Louise even spoke to Stacy's mother, Cynthia. I brought that up earlier in this episode. And I want you to think about that for a moment again. Here's a woman publicly pointing to Stacy as the person connected to her daughter's disappearance, yet she was also reportedly communicating with his mother after the fact. I can't help but find that dynamic unusual, because there is another reality that sits alongside all of this, and it is one that is difficult to reconcile. We know that Louise was extraordinarily strict with Barb. We know their relationship was often marked with conflict. We know Louise did not approve of Barb's rebellious behavior. And we know that she would have been deeply unhappy with Barb being involved romantically with anyone, particularly someone who was already well into adulthood. Let's not forget what happened just over a year and a half before Barb disappeared. The getting dragged by the hair out of a party incident. This was the same Louise Cotton who reportedly tracked her down at this party, physically dragged her out by her hair, and tossed her into the car. And let's be honest about what that party likely represented. Teenagers in 1980 weren't fundamentally different from teenagers today. Barb was there to socialize, push boundaries, drink, experiment, and spend time with boys. That was precisely the kind of environment Louise appears to have viewed as unacceptable. Which brings me to something that I have struggled with throughout this case. If Louise felt so strongly about boys, dating, parties, and Barb's increasingly independent behavior, why do we hear so little of that disapproval when Stacy enters the conversation? What stands out to me is not what Louise said, but what she didn't say. You didn't hear the kinds of statements that often come from a deeply disapproving parent. You don't hear, "I kept telling her to stay away from him." Nor did you hear, "She was not allowed to date." And you certainly didn't hear, "I warned her over and over again about boys." You don't hear the frustration, the resentment, or the repeated parental objections that one might expect if Stacy truly had been at the center of an ongoing conflict between Barb and her mother. Instead, Stacy is often discussed in a surprisingly matter-of-fact way, almost as though his role in Barb's life was accepted as a given. And maybe there's an explanation for that. Maybe those conversations happened and simply weren't documented. Maybe Louise expressed those sentiments privately, and they never found their way into reports, interviews, or public discussions. That's entirely possible. But as I look at the available information, I find myself wondering why those familiar signs of parental disapproval seem largely absent in this situation. Because when I compare Louise's reported actions towards Barb's behavior with the way Stacy is discussed, the two don't always fit together neatly. And that inconsistency is one of the reasons I've become increasingly skeptical that Stacy Werder deserves the central role he has occupied in the story for so many years. At the very least, it leaves me questioning whether the narrative surrounding him was ever as solid as many people have assumed. What's more, given everything that we've learned about the relationship between Barb and Louise, I find it difficult to believe that Louise would have had so much insight into Barb's personal life, particularly when it came to boys. By all accounts, their relationship had become strained, secretive, and increasingly adversarial. Unless Louise actually caught Barb with a boyfriend, I think the odds of her simply knowing about one, whether it was Stacy or someone else, are fairly low. And that raises a question that I found myself coming back to again and again. Did Louise merely hear rumors about Barb being with a boy, or did she actually discover it for herself? I believe she did discover something. Was that boy Stacy Werder? It could have been. Let's not forget that Stacy was already an adult, 6 years older than Barb, in fact. Either way, I can't completely rule him out, but at the same time, the only reason Stacy's name has remained so central to the story is because that's the narrative Louise Cotton put forward. Beyond that, I don't know that we would have enough to confidently say it was him. In fact, it could have been almost anyone. And that's an important point, because when I circle back to what Kathy and I believe is the most likely scenario, the identity of the boy may not matter nearly as much as people have assumed for all these years. Whether it was Stacy or any other kid or young man in Williston, I don't believe Louise would have approved. From everything we've heard, Barb spending time with a boy, teenager or otherwise, being somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, or doing something her mother had explicitly forbidden, would have been enough to trigger a serious confrontation between mother and daughter. That is where I keep arriving, and I'll circle back to that after we discuss these 3 theories. So of all the names that have surfaced over the years in connection with Barbara Cotton's disappearance, none has attracted more attention than Stacy. From the earliest days of the investigation, Stacy occupied the central place in the narrative. He was widely believed by some to have been Barb's boyfriend and was reportedly among the last people thought to have been associated with her before she vanished. Not long after Barb disappeared, Stacy left Williston for Montana, and approximately 3 months later, he took his own life. Those facts alone have led many people to view him as the most significant person of interest in this case. Some would even go so far as to say that he's a suspect. Adding to the suspicion were reports that some of Stacy's own sisters questioned whether he may have known more about Barb's disappearance than he ever revealed. According to those accounts, they had witnessed periods of increasingly volatile and unpredictable behavior from Stacy, leading his sisters to harbor concerns of their own. Taken together, it's not difficult to understand why Stacy's name has remained near the top of the discussion for all these years. At the same time, there are important facts that complicate that narrative. Later reporting suggested that Stacy's trip to Montana may not have been a sudden flight from scrutiny, but rather a trip that had been planned in advance for oil field work. In addition, at least one coworker reportedly stated that Barb did not travel to Montana with the crew, contradicting one of the long-standing theories surrounding her disappearance, that she ended up in Montana with Stacy. And that is where the story becomes far less certain. The circumstances surrounding Stacy have fueled suspicion for years, but suspicion and proof are not the same thing. While his name remains deeply intertwined with Barb's disappearance, many of the assumptions about his role have never been conclusively established. As a result, Stacy Werder remains one of the most discussed figures in this case. But whether that attention points towards guilt, coincidence, or something in between is a question that has never been definitively answered. In addition to that, Stacy taking his own life added yet another level of complexity to an already confusing and heartbreaking case. In many ways, it ensured that questions surrounding Barb Cotton's disappearance would continue to linger for many years to come. Whether Stacy possessed critical information, whether he knew more than he ever shared, or whether he had no involvement at all became questions that could never be fully answered by him. With his death, any opportunity to hear his side of the story disappeared as well. And in the absence of answers, speculation often fills that void. Over the years, that vacuum allowed theories, rumors, and suspicions to continue growing. For some people, Stacy taking his own life became evidence that he was somehow connected to Barb's disappearance. For others, it proved nothing at all. But regardless of where people landed, his death ensured that one of the central figures in the story would forever remain beyond questioning. As a result, the mystery surrounding Barb's disappearance only deepened. The case was left with more questions than answers, more possibilities than certainty, and one less person capable of shedding light on what actually happened during those crucial days back in 1981. And so the speculation continued. Next, let's talk about Frank de la Peña. Frank de la Peña found his way onto the list of persons of interest in Barb Cotton's disappearance, not because investigators uncovered direct evidence linking him to Barb, but because of a series of unsettling coincidences that, at least on the surface, make him part of the conversation. And while de la Peña may be worth mentioning, I am on board with all of this being coincidental. But as the story goes, at the time Barb vanished in 1981, de la Peña was living and working in Williston as a seismology worker. By itself, that fact means very little. Thousands of people lived and worked in and around Williston during that period. Simply being in the same town as a missing person does not make someone a suspect. According to later accounts, shortly after Barb disappeared, de la Peña reportedly suffered a mental health crisis. He lost his job, he was briefly hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation, and eventually he left North Dakota for Wyoming. Had that been the end of the story, it is unlikely anyone would remember de la Peña's name today. What brought him under great scrutiny was what happened next. Just weeks after Barb disappeared, authorities in Wyoming arrested de la Peña for the abduction and murders of two young girls, ages 9 and 12. According to witness accounts, de la Peña had allegedly been attempting to lure children into his van by telling them he had a puppy that needed a home. After the girls disappeared, investigators quickly identified de la Peña as a suspect and arrested him. And that is the point where people started looking backward. Those examining Barb's disappearance couldn't help but notice the timing. Here was a man who had been living in Williston when Barb vanished, only to be implicated shortly afterward in the murder of two young girls in another state. Naturally, questions followed. Could there be a connection? Had investigators overlooked something? Was de la Peña simply another resident of Williston who happened to be there at the time, or was there more to the story? Again, the truth is nobody knows, and that's where skepticism becomes important. Because despite the disturbing nature of de la Peña's later crimes, there is no publicly known evidence directly linking him to Barb. No witness has ever placed him with Barb. No physical evidence has surfaced connecting him to her disappearance. No confession has ever emerged. What exists instead is a collection of circumstances that many people find difficult to ignore. A dangerous man, at the right place, at the right time, and a tragedy that unfolded shortly afterward. Whether those facts represent a meaningful connection or simply a chilling coincidence remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding Barbara's disappearance. Despite the passage of time, de la Peña's name still surfaces whenever people discuss potential suspects. Not because anyone can definitively place him at the center of Barb's story, but because the timing is troubling enough that some researchers have never felt comfortable completely ruling him out. At the same time, troubling circumstances are not the same thing as evidence. And in a case already filled with speculation, assumptions, and missing pieces, that distinction matters. One detail, however, that has received attention comes from Barb's friend Diane. I mentioned this, I think, in either part 2 or part 1, I can't recall. According to accounts discussed in later investigations, Barb had mentioned plans involving taking a puppy to the veterinarian with a friend shortly before she disappeared. Separately, De La Pena used a puppy as a lure during his attempted abductions in Wyoming. There are those who have wondered whether this similarity could be meaningful. However, there is no known publicly available evidence showing that De La Pena was the person Barb planned to meet or that the two events were connected. I asked Kathy if Barb was trusting and gullible enough to fall for the stranger with the puppy ruse. Her answer was Barb was trusting, but not gullible. Whatever the case, De La Pena's story ultimately leads us to the same frustrating destination as so many other theories connected to Barb's disappearance: a dead end. And like Stacy Werder before him, De La Pena later died by his own hand while in custody awaiting extradition for the Wyoming murders. Over the years, that fact has inevitably fueled suspicion and speculation. For some, De La Pena's death has been viewed as one more suspicious piece of an already unsettling puzzle. But speculation and evidence are not the same thing. And when you strip away the assumptions and the rumors, the conjecture, and the natural tendency to connect tragic events, the reality becomes much less certain. Despite all the attention De La Pena has received from those looking into this case, nobody has ever publicly placed him with Barb. No witness has come forward saying that they saw the two together. There's no evidence that they knew one another. There's no evidence that they were even acquainted in any way. There's no evidence that their paths ever crossed at all. There has never been any publicly known physical evidence linking De La Pena to Barb's disappearance. No forensic evidence, no confession, no statement indicating knowledge of what happened to her. And perhaps most importantly, no law enforcement agency has ever identified Frank De La Pena as a suspect in Barbara Cotton's case. That's an important distinction because while the timing of his presence in Williston is undeniably unsettling, timing alone cannot solve this or any case. The truth is that De La Pena's connection to Barb rests almost entirely on timing and circumstance. He was in the area, he later committed horrific crimes, and he subsequently died before many questions about his own life could ever fully be answered. Those facts are troubling. They are enough to make people wonder. They are enough to keep his name in this conversation, but they are not enough to establish a connection to Barb. So while De La Pena remains one of the names that periodically resurfaces when Barb's disappearance is discussed, his involvement has always been based on possibility rather than proof. And after all these years, that distinction still matters, because in a case filled with theories, what we know is ultimately far more important than what we can only suspect. And when it comes to De La Pena, what we actually know is remarkably very little. Those who have looked into this case and conducted any level of investigation continue to examine Frank De La Pena's possible connection to Barb and her disappearance. They generally return to one undeniable fact. A man who was later proven capable of abducting and murdering children happened to be living in Williston at the exact same time a 15-year-old girl disappeared and was never seen again. That fact is difficult to ignore, but again, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't establish any connection, and it certainly doesn't answer any of the questions that have surrounded and clouded Barb's disappearance. But it does make people pause, because when investigators look back at unsolved cases, they naturally ask themselves whether known predators who were present at the time deserve another look, and De La Pena falls into that category. From a purely investigative standpoint, it is understandable why his name continues to surface. Here was a man who would later commit these terrible crimes against young victims. Here was a man who was living in the same community when Barb vanished. And here was a man whose actions would ultimately demonstrate a capacity for violence that few people could have imagined at the time. Taken together, those facts are enough to raise questions. But as troubling as the circumstances may be, Circumstances, again, are not evidence. It is not proof of anything. And in the end, that is what keeps De La Pena's name alive and in the discussions surrounding Barb Cotton's disappearance, not what is known, but what remains unknown. And I do not believe De La Pena had anything to do with Barb's disappearance, and neither does Kathy. So we're going to pause the story here and pick this up in the fourth and final part of this series. Please skip over to episode 335, which is part 4, to finish listening to this story. We will begin discussing the third person of interest whose name has long been a part of this conversation, and in discussing his potential role in this case, it does take us closer to home. So I will see you over in part 4. As always, take care, be safe, and sweet dreams.